How's everyone doing this afternoon? Good? Good. Okay, Ben, you want to say a few words just so we can make sure the volume sounds good?
Can you hear me okay? Good.
We're ready to go whenever you want to come up.
All right, here we go. Hello, I'm Keller Eady, and a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for being here with us. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the bipartisan mission of the Dole Institute. Members of the SAB receive opportunities to network with guests and preference when applying for our internship assistance or for paid student positions at the Institute. If you are a student and you would like to join, please contact us. The Dole Institute would like to hear from all of you. If you enjoyed today's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Our past and future programs are available to watch on video on our website. We'd like to encourage each of you to get special benefits and support the Dole Institute by becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Please let us know if you're interested. I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the program, we will have time for questions and answers. If you have a question, raise your hand and a student helper will come to you. Just ask one brief question, please. And now, please welcome Director Bill Lacey.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out today. We really appreciate your support. It's a nice, beautiful day, it looks like out there. So thanks for taking the time to come in and hear. And I want to thank our Young Americans for Liberty on campus are co-sponsoring today's event. Do we have any Young Americans for Liberty who are here? Okay, good, good. Well, yes, well, yeah, I know there's lots of you on campus. So. Yeah. So thanks to all of you for coming out. I think this is going to be, I know this is going to be a fascinating program because I've spent about 45 minutes talking with Ben. And we probably need to get a few more. Do we have plenty of chairs in the back for people? I'm trying to see if there are empty chairs because there's people standing. Okay. So you can go ahead and sit if you'd like to. Let me just begin by introducing Ben Domenech. He's the publisher of The Federalist and the senior fellow for the Heartland Institute. His experience includes serving as a speechwriter for HHS Secretary Tommy Thompson and Senator John Cornyn of Texas. Ben appears regularly on Fox and MSNBC. He wrote a fascinating piece that caught my eye in Politico that is the basis of this program. I saw it last September, and the way I got Ben here is in the internet age is I just emailed him and I said, wow, I really liked your piece today. Any chance I could get you to the Dole Institute to talk about that subject sometime? And he said, absolutely. So it was that easy. So please welcome Ben Domenech.
Thank you.
Ben, I referred to that piece in September, and you wrote the following. Depending upon which Republican you listen to, the rise of libertarian views among millennial Americans is either non-existent, a great threat to the country, or both. Few recognize the truth that it is a trend of the Republican Party's own making, and it represents an opportunity for the GOP to decide after almost a decade in the wilderness what kind of party it wants to be. A party still clinging to the compassionate conservative lie, or one that believes in the primacy of liberty. Explain why you wrote this and kind of what you're trying to get at.
Well, first off, let me thank you so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure. This is the first time I've been in Kansas, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come here. It's a beautiful building, and I've really welcomed the chance to learn about what you're doing here. The reason I really wrote this article is because I saw a number of writers across the spectrum on the right in America, conservative writers, moderates, who were talking about and debating the various poll numbers that they were seeing as regards to the opinions of young people in America. And essentially, there were a number of different positions being taken by these writers. On the one hand, there were those who said America is becoming more libertarian. Younger Americans are becoming more libertarian. They're libertarian on gay marriage, on marijuana, on privacy issues, on their view of police and their view of authority, things of that nature. And and some people were arguing that that was an opportunity, that essentially this was something that Republicans ought to look to as a way to reach out to young people and connect with them in a way that they have not traditionally. Then there were others who were saying, this is not actually libertarianism. This is just young people are more liberal than older people. It's something that we've seen before in generations. It's just a typical sort of thing that happens, and this is no different. And I think that the evidence really doesn't hold up when you look at it that way. I think that the thing that you do see among young people today, and this is something that endures even after I think they sort of pass the realm out of college and grow up into their own lives, is they have very different attitudes, I think, than prior generations about what the life well lived really looks like, what their pursuit of happiness looks like. And I think that that's something that increasingly, and we can get into this more, looks like a sort of libertarian trajectory as opposed to one that is just the traditional understanding of liberalism. But then I also think that there were some people who were making the case that, and this is, I think, the most dangerous case for the Republican Party, making the case that this is a problem and we should ignore this in young people. Instead, we should sort of double down on trying to reach out to people who have a more traditional view of the family, a more traditional view of life, that we just need to emphasize that as a way to increase our electoral gains. And I think that that's something that you see particularly among those who more than a decade ago were making the case for something called compassionate conservatism, for a conservatism that would reach out to people and that would be uplifting for them. And from my perspective, that's really the point that caused this whole trajectory of libertarianism in the country in recent years. And I think that a lot of the people who are considering themselves and talking about themselves as libertarians today are people who traditionally would have considered themselves just conservatives or something like that a decade and a half ago. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think one is they've looked at the kind of message that compassionate conservatism had to offer under George W. Bush, and they've seen it as something that didn't only fail to achieve its goals, but actually undercut the arguments for limited government. And I think that there's a line that you can draw on that that goes back decades and decades. If you go back to a phrase from William F. Buckley that when I was younger, never understood. He talked about don't immanentize the eschaton. Now, what does that mean? Okay, it's gobbledygook. But what it actually means is don't try to make utopia here on earth. Don't try to make the perfect here. Okay, because it can't be done. It's essentially an understanding based on human nature. Okay, about the nature of good and evil, that this will always be with us, the poor will always be with us, et cetera, and that because of that, you shouldn't embark on ridiculous attempts to achieve a utopian vision of society or culture. And I think that that's something that was a major part of the conservatism, the thread that ran from Goldwater through Reagan, and that was essentially a humility about what could be achieved through government. And it was a response to the progressivism that arose under Woodrow Wilson and that continued through LBJ, and that I think was really an understanding based on the ability of people to create a utopia, that we will destroy poverty in our time, that we can achieve these things. The concept that Wilson had was of something he referred to as the administrative state, the need to create essentially a group of elite administrators in Washington who could solve all of our problems, who would be able to fix these things. We have become enlightened and we know the right path forward, and that can be dictated from Washington. I think that the problem really emerged where after Reagan, there was a concern, I think, on the part of Republicans, particularly through the 90s, that they were being viewed as heartless and uncompassionate about the plight of poor Americans, that they didn't care about people who didn't look like them in particular. And so I think that this political rhetoric, this political message emerged among a lot of well-meaning social conservatives that we should lean on the idea of compassionate conservatism, a conservatism that would be focused on the uplift of people who did not look like traditional Republicans, on care for the poor. And I think that you can find sort of the apex of this moment in 2003 when George W. Bush said, when somebody's hurting, government's got to move. And he said that in an interesting context, actually. He said it in a speech about the need to continue unemployment benefits. Now, Fast forward to today. One of the leading voices for reform conservatism, which is essentially just a rebrand of compassionate conservatism, Michael Strain, who's the lead economist at the American Enterprise Institute, is also someone who argued very stridently against eliminating the continued unemployment benefits in the past couple of years. He said that they would make Republicans look heartless. He said that it would make them look like they don't care about the plight of the poor. As it happened, those unemployment benefits were eliminated in some states. And then gradually, they actually achieved a point where they were entirely eliminated. Many studies have since come out that confirm, I think, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that eliminating these benefits was one of the best things that could happen to the job market today. You ended up having people whose unemployment was no longer being subsidized, making the decision to go back into the workforce. They were taking the jobs that they hadn't wanted to take and that they had essentially been allowed to not take by having these redistributive benefits headed their way. And that's why you saw in states like North Carolina, where some of the benefits were the most generous, and this is the most interesting part, the states where the benefits were the most generous, when they cut those off, people took jobs. They went back to work, okay? And so I think again and again you see this compassionate conservative lie that essentially says we need to help people by redistributing money to them, and if we don't do that, we're heartless. We don't want to help people. I think that essentially what has happened is that lie has gotten through a lot of limited government conservatives who've now said, you know what, if conservatism is just about getting into a bidding war with progressives about how big the welfare state should be, how much we should redistribute, then maybe we should try something different. Maybe the fact is that liberty and freedom is more compassionate than redistributing one person's labor to another person. And I think that that's really the cause of the kind of philosophical libertarianism that you've seen on the rise among particularly younger conservatives in recent years.
The traditional fault line in the Republican Party and really in the conservative movement has been between traditionalists and more libertarian individuals. How's that changed now? How has that fault line evolved?
So I think it's evolved in a number of ways. I think, in one sense, I think it's interesting that if you rewind to particularly maybe the early 1980s and the late 1970s, you saw libertarians be a much smaller pocket of people. And partially I think that's because they had a lot of different priorities that, while I think were principled, were not necessarily matching up with the main priorities that you see today within libertarianism. I think traditional conservatives have always understood that the best hedge against big government is actually strong communities and families. They want strong communities and families because if you have those, then you have less crime, you have better educational systems, you have the ability to have fewer cops, you have the ability to have essentially more trust for your neighbors, and that those strong communities mean that you don't have to have the encroaching force of government to prevent criminality or these other actions against each other. That's something that I think traditional conservatives have always understood. I think that the error that they made is in thinking that that was something that needed more and more government to bolster it and that could be done or could be achieved in different ways. And I think that you've seen that repeatedly in a number of policies that have come out of Washington. But I also think that there was a strain of libertarianism that comes from that sort of Western conservative view, the Goldwater history, I think there, that always was within things. And you saw, Reagan referred to libertarianism as being a significant part of his own philosophy. It was something that I think always kind of ran through in an undercurrent, but I think it's grown in recent years primarily because, in a practical term, of the argument from a number of libertarian-leaning Republicans who, while they are libertarian on economic issues and while they are libertarian on a number of other issues, are personally people of faith and pro-life. And I think that it's not an accident that in the federal government today, virtually every libertarian-leaning Republican in Washington today, in fact, is personally pro-life. And you don't have, I think, a number of people who are viewed as anti-religious or secular, sort of making the case for libertarianism. There are still, I would say, a majority of libertarian-identifying people in America today would consider themselves pro-choice on abortion or maybe are less enthused about religion, but I think that what you've seen is the rise of politicians like the Pauls, like Justin Amash, like Mike Lee, have made it a possibility for those who are Christians, who are churchgoers, who are pro-life, to look at the issues involved and say, well, actually, I agree with him on virtually all these other things too. Does that mean that I'm a libertarian? And I think that there are a lot of people who've woken up to that in recent years for that reason.
Okay. Take a few minutes and talk about the main areas, the main issues where libertarians and social conservatives disagree. There's quite a few.
Sure.
There are
Hit
quite
the
high
few.
points.
Well, let me just say that I don't, inevitably in discussions like this, you paint with a broad brush. So if there's somebody in the room who disagrees with me, I understand, I expect it. But essentially I would say this, social conservatives, let's take, for example, someone like Mike Huckabee or someone like Bill Bennett. They have been emphatically in favor of the drug war. They have argued for years that that's something that needs to be an essential part of American policy, and they've argued that for a number of different reasons. I think the libertarian response to that would be that you've actually undercut the case for your social conservatism, because if you want intact families, if you want people to be able to raise their kids in a home with a dad, then maybe you shouldn't be throwing him in jail over marijuana. Maybe it should be something where we have a decriminalized policy toward drug use, or at least lower penalties for the kind of things that we see going on within that. I think that drug war is something that's really at the beating heart of sort of this issue, in the sense of the question that libertarians always ask, that limited government conservatives used to ask, was, is this something that government should even do? Is there a compelling interest for the government in doing this thing? And if there isn't, then maybe they shouldn't be playing in that space at all. And I think that that's something that extends to the conversation about marriage. I think that you see, certainly among the younger population, but increasingly among others as well, an attitude that says basically that I don't have a problem if gay people are getting married. I don't think that that's something that necessarily affects my view. And I think that you see that essentially increasingly among people who are not just libertarians, but people who are just sort of coming to the issue and realizing that this is maybe not as big of a threat to the family as we've been told over the years. And I think you've seen a number of social conservatives come around to that view as well. But I also think that this is something where there's an inherent conflict there about the prioritization involved. From my perspective, the gay marriage battle has actually been about something that's very different than marriage. I think personally that for gay Americans, the gay marriage battle is mostly about whether they can marry the person that they love. But I think for the secular left, they have essentially used the marriage battle to achieve other aims. Essentially, I think that the secular left in particular, want to banish from the public square the opinions of religious Americans. They want to force you into the freedom to worship as opposed to the freedom to actually express your religious views in public. And they want to, I think, increasingly frame religious people as naturally bigots or a part of organizations that we should push out of polite society. And I think that that's an issue where it's going to be critical in the coming years for libertarians, principled libertarians, to stand with and defend religious conservatives and believers for that religious liberty. Because religious liberty is the starting point of this entire nation. We don't have America without religious liberty. And I think that that's something that's going to be a critical point going forward. I think an additional point of contention, and this is kind of just the thumbnail experience that I've had in talking to young people, determining whether they are a libertarian or a conservative. And it's a simple question. It's, how do you feel about cops? And I think that the attitude that you see, particularly in recent years, of young people towards police, of minority members of our communities toward police officers, is increasingly one of distrust, and I think not without cause in many communities. I think that there's been an increased attitude that police forces are over-militarized, that they react over-aggressively to citizens, that they invade privacy, and that they get away with it, and that they don't want to be filmed when they're doing it. And I think that that's something that, for a lot of young people, is actually a critical fault line between sort of law and order Republicans, not in the sort of traditional conservative sense, and people who think there needs to be reform within that space. And then finally, I think there's obviously a major component of this that comes to the foreign policy and national security side of things. Many younger Americans who had friends who served overseas, who have had family members who served overseas, as I have, are largely skeptical of the aims of the nation-building democracy agenda in the Middle East, They view that as another sort of similarly to compassionate conservatism, a perhaps nobly intended but faulty and ultimately unsuccessful attempt. And so because of that, I think they're very skeptical about overseas involvement. They're very skeptical about putting their friends and members of their own generation in harm's way for ends that they don't believe in. I think the American people are actually have actually been pretty consistent when it comes to foreign policy, which is that for the most part, they do not engage in sort of an over-optimistic view of what we can achieve, and they're fine with, in certain spaces where we need to, using the force of the American military to kill bad guys who actually intend us harm. But they do not want to get into these extended and overly utopian approaches to immanentizing the eschaton, be it in Iraq or be it here. And I think that that's a skepticism that is inherently libertarian and that is expanded among young people today.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's fair to view social conservatives as big government conservatives?
I think that depends. I think that social conservatives who have confidence in the ability of their ideas to win the day are increasingly questioning the tendency toward big government. And I guess an example of that would be social conservatives, I think, have an inherently Burkean attitude toward the way they view the ideal society. That is, people working in these little communities together to relate to each other, that this sort of localism is something that they understand is valuable. But I think that has been overwhelmed in recent years by social conservatives who, instead of wanting these values and virtues to naturally exist within the communities, and to have essentially the lessons of the marketplace that say, if you're the responsible businessman, that over time you will actually benefit over the irresponsible businessman, that we don't need to subsidize one or bring down the other, that people will learn from that experience. Instead, they've wanted to use the force of government policy, regulatory policy in particular, from Washington to dictate what that looks like. And I think that that's not just something that runs against liberty, but it also runs against federalism and it runs against localism. And just to give you an example of this, to show that this is not a new thing, back in the early days of Governor Reagan's tenure, one of the first times he came to Washington, it was to testify in opposition to a plan by President Nixon at the time to nationalize the welfare system. Nixon wanted to bring it all to Washington, have Washington decide what every welfare system looked like, decide who gets subsidies, et cetera, decides who gets paid more and who gets paid less. And Reagan was very much opposed to that. He came in and he said, this is ridiculous. The states are different states. We have different priorities. The people of California want to have the welfare system like this. You want to have it like this. And ultimately, he gathered together a group of conservative governors and they defeated Nixon's plan, which was a pretty big deal, because if that hadn't happened, we never would have had welfare reform, because you never would have had the ability for states to experiment and to come up with something, in this case in Wisconsin, that ultimately led to the welfare reform under Gingrich, Dole, and Clinton. I think from my perspective, the thing that is most damaging about social conservative big government policies is when it takes money from certain people and hands it to other people arbitrarily and then says that that is compassion. And here's a perfect example of it. In Indiana, Governor Mike Pence, who is a conservative, who has been, is certainly considered a conservative by his record. In the Congress, he was certainly considered conservative. He has just spent enormous political capital expanding the Medicaid program in his state in accordance with Obamacare. And his argument for that, which he gave in Washington in a very passionate speech and quoted Jesus and talked about, how the need for compassion and things of this nature, it has now gotten to the point where he has put essentially 250,000 able-bodied, childless, working-age adults on a welfare program, okay, that takes money from other people and, in fact, from other states and hands it arbitrarily to them simply based on how much money they make. Now, I have a personal story to tell about this because one of my employees at the Federalist lives in Indiana, and she and her husband are perfectly fine. They have 2 kids, and she discovered to her horror that she qualified for the program. And she wrote a very passionate article for us at the Federalist about how insulted she was to learn that, that Governor Pence was saying that it was compassionate to take money from other people and hand it to her. okay? And the truth of the matter, of course, is that she's the exception. Most people will just take that money. And it used to be that limited government conservatives understood that that was a damaging thing, that this was not a good thing for society. I think, unfortunately, a lot of social conservatives have gotten to the point where they've convinced themselves that redistribution, as Lincoln phrased, you work and toil and earn bread and I'll eat it, is something that is somehow compassionate, when in fact, historically, we know that it's not the case at all.
Mm-hmm. We talked about this a little bit in my office, but in the 50s and the 60s, the conservative movement, there was a portion of the conservative movement called Fusionism, and Frank Meyer was considered the leading intellectual proponent of that, one of Buckley's friends. And he said, conservatives have to stick together because we have all these big issues we agree on. Is there somebody out there like that now? And is there a way that you can get libertarians and social conservatives to come together or to stay together?
Well, first to the point that the first point you made, in the 50s and 60s, yes, there was this conversation that actually seems a lot like the conversation that we're having today. The issues are different, but the philosophical points are still largely the same. And it was a conversation between, leading intellectuals, Harry Jaffa, William F. Buckley. Jaffa just passed away, in fact, Frank Meyer, many other intellectuals who are on the right. And essentially what Meyer proposed was this. And keep in mind that this is in the context of the battle against the Soviet Union, of the understanding of the need to put forward candidates who can appeal not just to business owners and to free market people, but also to social conservatives, to populists, et cetera. Meyer essentially proposed, we're not actually at odds. We believe in something that has been instilled since the founding and that is in the actual creation of America, and that's in a limited approach to government. We believe in the people. And that's something that he proposed as being, the concept of fusionism was essentially a coming together of these people who had different priorities, but had a similar aim in terms of their ultimate goal. And that included national defense conservatives who believed in the importance of defeating the Soviet Union. It included economic libertarians and free market types, and it included social conservatives. And basically what his understanding was that all these different aspects needed each other in order to achieve their goals. And that the case that he made was that this is not a marriage of convenience, but it's actually something that's consistent with our understanding of the founding and the kind of vision that the founders had for our country. The problem is that I think that in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think that you ended up having these different groups kind of go in separate ways. And you had the inability of those sorts of groups to stay together, in part because you had leaders emerge within the Republican Party who had different priorities. And I would actually include, just to use the most recent nominee as an example, I think Mitt Romney is a good example of someone who is, whether he's a good man or not, is essentially a technocrat. He believes that government ought to be doing certain things and that it should do those things most efficiently, and that it should respond to the various demands of the people in those ways. He doesn't ask the question, the essential limited government question of, is this something government should even do? And that's, I think, the point where fusionism breaks down. In terms of people who are able to hold it together today, I've been very encouraged by the rise of libertarian ideas among people who would never consider themselves libertarians before, or who would never call themselves that before. There are different ideas that have gotten into the mainstream, I think, of conservative thought and in terms of their conversation today that never would have been there even as recently as 10 years ago. And I think that that's in part because they hear those concerns from their base. And I think a perfect example of that is the debate over Common Core. I think that Common Core is something that animates a lot of populist and libertarian mothers and fathers who are concerned about the experience that their children are having in the educational environment. And it's backed by people like Bill Bennett, by people like Jeb Bush. And I think that is essentially, when you get right down to it, a technocratic solution, a top-down solution to the kinds of educational problems that we have today in the country. Again, perhaps well-meaning. I don't think that there's anything, untoward about sort of the aims, but I still think that the essential critique that a lot of conservatives, libertarians, and even some liberals have of Common Core is this turns children into cogs in the machine. It turns them into, it's built more for the businesses that people think they want to work for, as opposed to teaching them how to learn, teaching them to be creative. and it cuts off the ability of parents to teach their children math, to teach them in the ways that they learn themselves. And so I think that that's a good example of something that, perhaps, as recently as 15 years ago, might have been accepted doctrine within the Republican Party, but is now being questioned by, a number of candidates, and is probably going to be a critical issue in the coming presidential campaign.
In talking about a libertarian trend that you see in the country, how do you think that's going to manifest itself in the 2016 Republican nomination contest?
Well, I think you already see it manifesting itself in the different approaches that have been made. Ted Cruz obviously is the only announced candidate, but his campaign, when they were talking about the different factions of the Republican Party that they viewed as having that they needed to appeal to, they talked about movement conservatives and pro-business types. They talked about moderate and establishment types. They talked about Tea Party and activist conservative types, and then they talked about libertarians. Okay, now I don't know that that's an actual accurate representation of the people who make up the Republican coalition. I would think it's a little bit different than that. I think there are a number of people I think who are in that coalition who are effectively single issue voters, whether they be a gun owner, whether they be pro-life, what have you. But I also think that there is something there in the sense that already the first candidate in the race is saying that's a population that I'm going to have to appeal to. I think that you're going to see a number of candidates take positions and be forced to take positions because of Rand Paul's likely presence in the race that are on issues that they may never have talked about before. One thing I think in particular that's going to be interesting this cycle is what the shape of the debate over foreign policy looks like, and also what the shape of the debate over government invasion of privacy looks like. I think that there are more and more people, and this is again particularly young people who spend so much time on their phones and spend so much time on social media, who are concerned about unrestricted power of government when it comes to looking at our data and looking at our information, particularly without a warrant. I think that's going to be an interesting thing to see Republican candidates respond to. I also think they're going to be responding to, in very short order, a gay marriage decision, which I think is going to be to perhaps throw a real wrench in the works in terms of how they talk about the issue. I also think that they're going to be responding to a broad push that is currently happening at the state level for criminal justice reform, which has been a priority for libertarians for decades and is now actually finally getting some attention, in part because of the priorities that have been put on it in Washington, but also I think because of the fact that it cuts across traditional lines. Yesterday, at a conference organized by the Koch brothers, there was a speech given by Van Jones and by Newt Gingrich and by a couple of other people who you would never put on a stage together, all agreeing that we need criminal justice reform. But guess what? They do, because they understand the issue, and that's been something that libertarians have been beating the drum about for a long time, because they understand that our prison systems don't actually do what we want them to do. We understand that perhaps we're creating more criminals than we are rehabilitating folks, and that we need to reconsider and maybe change the way that we approach these things. So I think in all those different circumstances, you're going to see candidates responding to issues and being asked questions about issues that before they never would have been asked because of the traditional way that we approached campaigns and because of the sort of closed access to being able to ask people these questions. I think now they recognize that there's a sizable enough portion of people who in the country who care about these issues that they feel like they have to respond.
Take a moment, Ben, if you would, and tell us who some libertarian Republicans are as examples, and then who some social conservatives are as examples. You can use people in the presidential race or not in the presidential race.
Well, obviously Rand Paul is sort of the tops of the list of those who define kind of what a libertarian Republican looks like. I think though that there are a number of other Republicans who have certain aspects of their agenda that go into the libertarian space. I think Justin Amash in the House is someone who's been a leading voice on foreign policy issues. He was primaried in part because of that, unsuccessfully. He was reelected, and I think that you also see, particularly one of the most interesting members of the Senate today, Mike Lee, who has really become a prominent intellectual figure within the Senate in very short order, and someone who's charting kind of the policy agenda for the Republican Party in a very sizable way. Now, I would say that all of these people lean libertarian to different degrees. There's some people who are more libertarian on foreign policy, some of them who are more libertarian on the way that they view the role of government. But I think that one thing that's consistent is that, and as I mentioned before, is that they all have, I think, a certain amount of credit with voters who might personally be social conservative because of their own personal views on the importance of their own religion or the importance of family, the importance of the life issue or something else. And all of these things allow people who have traditionally viewed themselves as, just down the line conservatives to say, well, maybe it's possible to have these views, but to also be a libertarian and not have that be something that's in conflict. Maybe that doesn't mean that I'm uncompassionate or that I don't care about my fellow man. And I think that in all of these senses, you see the growth of this as a portion of the party. What you don't really see yet is it being reflected more in the leadership of the party. It's still something that I think is just a small faction. It's not something that's necessarily borne out in the way that you might see it in the future as some of these folks who were originally elected in the 90s age out and some of the newer blood comes in.
Okay, I have one final question, Ben, and then we'll open it up to any questions and answers that you and the audience may have this afternoon. I'm curious, looking at the Democratic Party, does the Democratic Party have a fault line between social and economic issues? A similar one kind of to the GOP fault line?
It's interesting. It doesn't get anywhere near as much attention, but it is a very interesting fault line, and it's one that you're actually going to see, or that you've seen the initial noise about, borne out in this coming election. The most significant opposition from those in the Democratic Party who do not want Hillary Clinton to go unchallenged is from the economic side. It's from the populist economic perspective that understands that the top 5 donors to Clinton over the years have all been Wall Street banks. Okay, they understand that the priorities are not those of what you might consider the traditional populist kind of presentation of the Democratic economic policy agenda. One of the reasons that that's happened, and it's happened under President Obama as well, is that the Democratic Party has largely shifted away from that kind of economic agenda and has instead used culture war issues to further themselves in terms of getting reelected. The conversation about the war on women in the last cycle, the conversation about gay marriage, everything else that has come with these social agenda issues has been what the Democratic Party has put at the front on the national level, and it's been something that President Obama has done repeatedly and that I think Hillary Clinton will do as well. At the same time, they've essentially lowered the priority of a lot of the economic agenda items, or they've turned them into lip service, the conversation about the minimum wage, something that would never actually come to pass in terms of the kind of increase to $12, and as they've discussed in Washington. That sort of stuff has been shunted off to the side, and essentially from my perspective, the Democratic Party on the national level as a whole has become far more corporatist, far more interested in the priorities of big business, in the priorities of Wall Street. And I think that fault line is something, though, that may not end up coming to fore if she ends up not getting challenged by someone with an Elizabeth Warren-style message or something of that nature. If this all ends up being just about Hillary cracking that last glass ceiling, it's going to mean that the Democratic Party is essentially going to keep this economic agenda disagreement as an undercurrent. The biggest problem for Democrats is in terms of this past election, and the National Democrats really do all agree about this, is that they de-emphasize the importance of economic issues for those who are struggling and basically had this rah-rah, the economy's back, everything's fine message, hence why they turned to the issues of inequality and things like that afterward. And that, I think, is something that they really don't understand in terms of the problems of wage stagnation among the middle class, among the working class across the country. That is in part due, I would say, to the decay of private unions over the course of this time, but it's also due, I think, to competition and essentially the opening up of global markets. But I think that the problem for the Democratic side really is, in order to achieve the kind of economic solutions that you would need to have, you would actually have to run up against a lot of your traditional constituent groups. A good example of this is Gavin Newsom's book. He's viewed as one of the rising stars of the Democratic Party from California. Everybody expects him to be the next governor there after Jerry Brown. And Newsom, who is a charming and handsome guy, wrote this very interesting book that basically went through and said, we need to have all these dramatic reforms of regulation and dramatic reforms of how we do things because government is slow and it's entrenched and it's not allowing for innovation, it's not allowing for people to have sort of the on-demand experience they want from government. The problem is, in order for him to do that, he'd have to take on the public employee unions in California, which is not something that he's able to do within the current construction of the Democratic Party. So I think that the problem for us right now in terms of as we look at the Republicans and as we look at the Democrats, I actually think the Republicans have less of a problem if they're willing to get past this idea that you need to use government in order to further a vision of what society looks like, and instead get government out of the way so people can decide for themselves. And I think that if Republicans do that, they actually have a much clearer path to bringing in younger voters, to bringing in new voters. I think Democrats, on the other hand, have a real challenge in terms of how they navigate what the kind of post-private union but public employee union world looks like, and who they're going to essentially cut off, because there's an inherent tension there in terms of their economic policy that I think not all of them have fully grasped yet. So I think, with that essentially in terms of the way that social conservatives view their priorities, I think within the next few months in particular, you're going to see this conversation bubble up into the 2016 cycle as they struggle with what they do in a context where the culture war has shifted, in a context where religious liberty is going to become a much bigger deal for them than I think the marriage fight has been. And I think that that's going to present them with an opportunity and a challenge. And if they double down on the past, if they double down on the approach that they've used in the past, I think that'll be an error. If they view it as the opportunity that I think it is, I think that they'll succeed.
Okay. We're going to open up to your questions and answers. If you have a question, raise your hand, and Claire will bring a mic by, and I'm sure we're going to have lots of interesting questions. So,
hi, my name's Eric. Ben, I want to ask you about what I think is a conflation of social conservatism and big government conservatism that's not fair. And the examples that you used were Bush-era policy, okay, and then the war on drugs, both of which I would say are relatively outdated. When I look at Washington today, I see a big government conservatism in charge, but certainly not a social conservative one. And when I think about who the leaders of both social conservatism and limited government conservatism are, it's places like the Heritage Foundation, a great example under Jim DeMint, and then locally, someone like Sam Brownback, who is certainly known as a social conservative, but no one could argue he has a big government agenda. So why am I wrong?
I think you're wrong because I think that the biggest areas of policy where social conservatives have made impact is the way to assess it. And I think that that's within the examples that I used. Essentially, I mean, if you think about how social conservatives have impacted policy in the past, 15 to 20 years, what does it look like? A dramatically increased child tax credit and drug policy and Bush's stem cell policy. Is there anything else I'm leaving out? Maybe some international religious liberty stuff. I don't think that social conservatives have actually had a significant impact on policy in beyond those terms, really. I mean, since Hyde Amendment or something like that. Do you want to give him the mic back if you wanted to? No. I guess the way that if you're going to expand it though, who are the leaders of social conservatism today? Well, I think in the context of the 2016 election, it's going to be Rick Santorum. It's going to be Mike Huckabee. It's going to be, to some degree, I think Ted Cruz is certainly trying to make a play for social conservatives, but perhaps not as one. That'll be interesting to watch. The thing that I think, though, that's interesting in terms of the social conservative sort of cause as a whole is I think that if you rewind to 2004 and you see the kind of major play that was made by the Republican Party to increase evangelical voters, it was made on the gay marriage threat. It was essentially something that Karl Rove and others in the Republican Party intentionally used to try to drive up the numbers among evangelical voters. And I think that this was something that was essentially, with no disrespect to Rove, a pretty craven political move, just in the sense that they felt like their numbers had not been high enough in 2000, that they needed higher numbers in order to succeed. So they ginned up sort of the conversation about this and then doubled down on it. I think that the social conservative leaders in the party today have really become increasingly isolated. That the priorities in Washington in particular are dictated not by social conservatives, but by K Street, by Wall Street. I mean, if K Street and Wall Street wanted the kind of abortion restrictions that have been sort of an item of discussion in the recent weeks as attached to one of the budget bills. If they wanted that, that would have already happened, okay? But they want immigration reform. They want Keystone. They want, all these other priorities, and that's why Republican leadership talks about them. Probably the most social conservative person in the leadership of the Republican Party right now, personally, is probably Blunt. But there's just not, social conservatives don't run the party anymore. I think that's kind of it's not something that has been true for a long time. And so really the reason that I would just use those as an example is because I think that they're holdovers from the social conservative approach in terms of how you do policy. And that's something that I think is, Bill Bennett is no longer, I think, directing where the party goes. Let's put it that way. I think he can still go on TV and talk about the need for to continue the war on drugs, but I don't think that he speaks for the vast majority of Republicans when he says that.
Okay, next question.
Hello, I'm Alex. I'm a PhD student in the history department here at KU. I study the history of conservatism. I find your talk pretty fascinating. But I'm wondering if we go back to kind of the founding texts of libertarianism, The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, Human Action by Ludwig von Mises, we see that libertarianism is about individual freedom more than anything else. But I find it interesting that it's always freedom from government, freedom from the state that gets talked about. But why don't you think libertarians talk much about freedom from kind of big corporations or big corporate power as much as they talk about freedom from the state? I mean, shouldn't libertarians, as well as people on the left, be worried about the kind of power that these gigantic entities have and that they can influence not only politics, but also onto a personal level? I mean, it seems to me that libertarians don't necessarily talk about that side of kind of power as much as they talk about state power. And so take, for example, the Koch brothers. I mean, they were very influential in founding the Cato Institute. But are they really interested in promoting individual freedom, or are they just interested in promoting another version of kind of enforced power?
Sure. Well, let me just say that I think that when it comes to the prioritization of sort of who has the most power, government is nearly always going to come before the kind of form of corporate power and Wall Street power that you've seen used and expanded over the past several decades. I think that there is a danger, though. Big business meaning successful business, is not, from I think the libertarian perspective, a problem. Big business from the perspective of business that warps the marketplace in its favor is an enormous problem, okay? Where business warps the marketplace in ways that prevent competition, which is something that most big businesses do, it becomes a huge problem, okay? So here's an example. Elon Musk, he's obviously a very prominent person. He's done all these different projects, and he considers himself like Iron Man and stuff like that. And so he builds solar panels. Now, I have no problem with him building solar panels. That's totally fine. What I have a problem with is taking money from taxpayers to help fund him building those solar panels. And then he recently had an issue where he went and he got a pretty big grant from a state on the promise that he would create local jobs. But then what he did is, instead of hiring local people, which is what you would think that was about, he hired prisoners, okay, at 63 cents an hour, to build those solar panels, okay? Again, funded by the taxpayer. From my perspective, the problem with big business, the problem with Wall Street, the problem today of all these powerful corporations is not that they are successful. It is that they use their success to then buy their way to eliminating any potential competition within the marketplace. And that's about as anti-American as you can get, okay? The whole idea, in terms of founding texts, that you mentioned a couple, obviously, but Friedrich Bastiat's law is really, I think, the starting point, for anyone who wants to sort of have an initial understanding of what economic libertarianism looks like. And I think that the fundamental point that he's making, again and again, is, that our critics say, and this is a French economist, he says, our critics say that because we do not want the government to grow wheat, that we are opposed to having bread. This is ridiculous. Of course we want to have bread, okay? We just don't think that the government should be growing wheat or subsidizing someone else to grow wheat or preventing someone else from growing wheat. And I think that that's the real, problem that we run into. The Supreme Court just struck down a terrible law in North Carolina that essentially had been built up by the various dental practitioners that was designed to keep people from being able to whiten teeth without going through this whole rigmarole, and it was designed to prevent competition. They wanted to be able to raise their prices up. It's essentially acting like a cartel. And that's the point where business becomes a problem. And I think that is something that libertarians have historically put at a lower level, only because there's so much more to talk about when it comes to government. But I think that is an error, and I think that's one of the reasons why in recent years you've seen more libertarians speak to the dangers of cronyism and of corporatism, and I think that that's something that people are more aware of across the country generally.
Okay, other questions?
Yes. The social conservatives and the libertarian Republican candidates seem to be following all over themselves to try to get in first place and win the Iowa caucus. If you look at history, it looks like winning the Iowa caucus is a perfect formula for not winning the nomination.
You are correct, sir. Certainly not winning the presidency. I do think that they're doing that. I do think it's interesting. It will be very interesting to see how many of them hold to a libertarian position or take a libertarian position when it comes to, speaking to corporatism, ethanol subsidies. It'll be interesting to see what they have to say on the issue. I saw Ted Cruz reject them at the Iowa Ag Summit the other day, and I do not think that necessarily went over that well. Rand Paul has rejected them in the past. We'll see if he continues to do so. But it looks like a lot of them are going to be saying that they're fine with it, which is going to be interesting.
We'll get to you in a minute, ma'am.
Ben, welcome to Kansas.
Thank you.
My name is Ed Ray. I've lived in Liberal City, Kansas for 23 years. And I'm sorry that you had to come here. If you'd gone to Western Kansas, they'd laughed you right out of the boat. But my question is, why do you use the term social conservatives instead of constitutional conservatives?
Why do I use the term social conservative instead of constitutional conservative? Well, I'm not really sure what a social conservative necessarily looks like anymore. I mean, we've used the examples of Rick Santorum and Mike Huckabee. I used the example of Bill Bennett. I think that social conservatives have generally been, as a definition, people who've approached these various issues as from the perspective of using government to achieve certain ends. They tend to be opposed to the allowance of gambling, the allowance of prostitution, the allowance of drugs, the allowance of any sort of libertarian approach to these issues. But I think a constitutional conservative might take the opposite perspective in a number of ways, because from their perspective, that would be something that would be reserved to the states or the people to decide, as opposed to something that needed to be decided according to federal policy, or maybe something that government doesn't even need to decide at all if they look at the actual way that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights was constructed. So I think there's some overlap there, but I don't think that they necessarily embody the same vision of conservatism.
Okay, I know we have a question right up here on the front row. Okay, very good.
Real quick to tag on what you're saying, don't you think that some more of the conservative members of the Republican Party are seeing people like Mike Pence and perhaps compromising the issues that they are like-minded, and that is causing a migration away from the establishment party or the establishment people that are running the Republican Party and going to the Libertarians because they think they're going to be more likely to be principled and to take a stand on those issues?
I do think that's certainly possible. I think that basically the perspective that a lot of people have now is if you come at it from the perspective of this kind of compassion talk, it's inevitable that inevitably you're going to get into a debate about how big you want that welfare state to be, as opposed to whether or not it should exist. And I think that that's really the libertarians tend to ask the more extreme question. They say, should this even exist? Should we even do this? Okay, and that's not something that I think you hear a lot of people who consider themselves traditionally conservatives asking anymore, with a few exceptions. So.
This lady's been very patient. Wait for the microphone, ma'am.
Oh, thank you. I'm confused about the point you were making on Medicaid expansion.
Sure.
Because what I heard didn't make sense to me, so I'm sure I heard it wrong. But you had an example of a woman who was offended somehow by
Yes.
being offered expansion.
Yes.
And she was a married woman with a child, which is not someone I feel is offered Medicaid expansion or Medicaid at all. So I'm confused about that.
So under Obamacare's Medicaid expansion, traditionally in most states, Medicaid had been prioritized for people, single moms with children, people in need. Basically, it had not been extended based simply on how much money you made. The Obamacare Medicaid expansion brought all of that up. So if you accept the Medicaid dollars under Obamacare, you basically have a line that is determined relative to, it's essentially determined relative to your poverty rate. And then everybody below that line, in terms of their annual income, automatically qualifies. The reason she qualifies is because her husband isn't working, he's a student. And so they're a single income family with 2 kids, and in Indiana, underneath their expansion, she's under that in terms of how much money she makes in the year, and that means that she automatically qualifies for the program. The additional problem with this is that you're not allowed to go outside the program. So you don't even have the freedom to choose to not be in the program. You have to be in it. And so essentially the Obamacare transformed Medicaid from being something that was originally intended to target to the poorest of the poor, the sickest of the sick, into something that basically just takes an arbitrary dollar amount and says everybody who makes less than this qualifies.
So you're saying she didn't need health care?
Yeah, she already had her insurance before he expanded the program.
She's an employed person who gets
Yeah.
health care
Yeah.
for her husband and her family.
Yes.
But then she's offered Medicaid, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Well, it didn't make a lot of sense to her either. Yeah.
So is this on Medicaid
Yes.
or in some other part of health care?
Yeah.
We need to move on to our next question. I want to get in as many as I can, but I also want to try to get everybody out of here in give me another 5 minutes or
You
so.
mean you've only got 5 minutes?
Yes, sir.
Ben, thank you for being here. It's been very insightful for you to share your observations over the years. I got to tell you right off the bat, I'm ordained clergy, and I know all about conservatism and liberalism. I've been in the fights for years. The question I have for you is, I recently read an article in our local newspaper, and I want to say it was George Wills, but I'm not sure about that, about the title of it was that culture, more than economics, is the big issue in finding equality in our country, in the world really. And my question is the Republican Party ever going to get around to addressing the cultural differences that we live with? Or is that just a utopian idea?
One of the things that I think is sort of sad about this is that I do think that cultural values far more inform the outcomes that we experience in terms of our lives than almost anything else. But I do think that for all the times that you might hear a conservative say, particularly a religious conservative, say that politics is downstream from culture. In other words, that people start with culture and then it navigates into their political views, which is true because most people do not start their day talking about what's happening on the Hill or what's happening in this committee or what policy is happening. They talk about Taylor Swift, or they talk about Michael Sam, or they talk about something that they saw on TV, okay? And that's the starting point. But guess what? It's all politics, okay? You can listen to sports radio all day, and you're going to hear about Title IX, you're going to hear about gender issues on campus, you're going to hear about controversies about crime, you're going to hear about controversies about drug use. These are all politics, okay? But they're also cultural things, starting points. I think the problem for Republicans is largely that they're scared of talking about these issues. In Virginia, I live in Virginia, and in this past gubernatorial, well, I think they're worried that they'll come across poorly or that they will be painted as ignorant or out of touch or bigots or something of that nature. But there was an interesting bit of research that was done after Ken Cuccinelli, the Republican gubernatorial candidate, lost his election after being painted in very extreme ways as being part of the war on women and everything like that. And the research essentially showed that he would have been far better off essentially being bolder on the issue, essentially coming out more aggressively in terms of his stance and taking the argument to the other candidate that basically the polling data indicated he might have done better had he done that. And instead he was more reluctant because he had a very social conservative record. And he was someone who I think essentially was advised by his consultants, don't talk about that. But I think not talking about it might be an error. You know, if he actually said, you know, look, I want to have strong communities. You know, what's the way to get to a strong community? The other guy has an approach that I disagree with and made the case for it that way. It may actually be better to be a little divisive about these issues, but to be bold in saying what you actually believe. And I think that that's something that that Republicans, you know, traditionally have hemmed away from. They're a lot more comfortable talking to the Chamber of Commerce. So.
Okay, we're going to take one more question. I'm sorry we're out of time, but I try to end these at 4, and I know some of you may want to get going. But we will be having a reception out in Hanson Hall with some snacks and drinks, and you get a chance, and Ben will hang around, and he'll be able to answer any questions that you have personally. So here we go, right here.
So when a young person, so I kind of agree. I'm glad you came.
Hello, young person.
Yeah, nice to see you out here. So I think when people talk about the Republican Party, they tend to talk about it in just because it's easier, kind of like the Reagan stool, so the social conservatives, the libertarians, the kind of country club Republicans. In my view, I don't see the Republican Party going to libertarianism as more as libertarian inserting a few ideas that, honestly, when you sit down and think about it, actually fit into the conservative ideas. And so I think a big mistake that conservatives make is treating all social issues the same. So to me personally, I think gay marriage and, say, the drug war is completely different than abortion. So do you see more people coming, the party more libertarian, or just libertarians, people like Rand Paul coming up and injecting new ideas, and the Republican Party just kind of taking those ideas forward as still the conservative party?
I think it's both. I think that libertarian ideas, I think, have now reached an amount of critical mass where Republicans feel like they have to either respond or accept some of those ideas. And that means that you're not going to necessarily have a slew of libertarian Republicans elected, but you are going to have these ideas get to the point where, you know, they're going to be, I mean, essentially audit the Fed became something that mainstream Republicans talk about because Ron Paul talked about it enough. Like, he just talked about it long enough, and now they have to talk about it, you know? And that sort of thing, I think, is something that, you know, same with the criminal justice reform stuff. You know, this is something that Republicans just never really wanted to talk about. And then essentially in the last 4 or 5 years, now they all want to talk about it. And I think that that's the way that I think libertarian ideas have navigated their way through this is in part due to the fact that libertarians as a whole are not really an organized people. Okay, we are naturally, I think, individualist and independent. And I think that means that those ideas winning are more important than necessarily the people who are winning. And I think that that's really the reason why I think the libertarian future is so promising in terms of the Republican Party. It's because those ideas really are them getting back to that limited government approach, that constitutional approach that they should have had to begin with, that they should have had and continued even when they were wishing that they came across to the pages of the New York Times editorial page as more compassionate. And I think that that's something that is healthy for the party and that is good for the party. And the real question will just be, do those ideas have staying power? You always see with any politician the lip service that they will give to something before an election and then the priorities that they actually have after that election. And I think that the test for these libertarian ideas and how serious Republicans are about them is going to be, are these issues still the issues we care about on the day after the election? Or are our priorities simply the same Chamber of Commerce, K Street, traditional priorities that we've had over the past few years that haven't really gotten us anywhere? So,
Okay, Ben, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out. Like I say, we'll be having some snacks and drinks out in Hanson, and you'll get a chance. A lot of you had questions that you didn't have a chance to get answered. Come on up and ask Ben. He'll answer them for you. Thank you.